Alright, so I don't know about you, but not only do I want to be eating good food, but I also don't want to break the bank. And when it comes to making food from scratch, bread is actually decently cost effective. Sure, there's cheap bread, but the bread that's more nutritious is way more expensive, especially when you compare it to the price of 10 pounds of flour. Store-bought bread also tends to make some bold creative decisions with their ingredient list. When you consider that bread is literally just flour, water, yeast, and salt, that can be a little concerning. But you can either make bread with a sourdough starter like this. I've developed this one for a couple years now. Or you can make a good loaf with some instant yeast too. My mom got me into instant yeast bread baking with this book right here, which is actually from another YouTuber, Artisan Bread with Steve. Definitely check him out. And the very first loaf I ever made was this country white bread right here. The ingredients and the procedure is so super simple, anyone can do this bread. It comes down to combining the ingredients into a shaggy ball and then just leaving it to proof overnight in like your oven with the light on, and then the next day degassing it, just punching it down, and then, shaping it into your little bread loaves, letting it rest for another hour and a half or so, and then baking at 400 degrees for 40 minutes. The only thing a little concerning is that, you have a little ball the night before, and then when you wake up it's this giant poof monster. That's because instant yeast gases up good, so you just kind of do this with a wooden spoon, degas it, and then you do what you gotta do to shape it, and then just rest it in that little pan. These make really excellent loaves for sandwiches or any other kind of like everyday lunches. And this recipe yields about 2 loaves, and so this is actually a picture of one that I baked myself, and this is what I used to do before I started doing sourdough. And while sourdough is definitely a little bit more difficult to do, I definitely recommend it because sourdough actually counts as a fermented food. It's lower glycemic index, and it's actually a lot easier for your body to digest than instant yeast. And it also makes some really delicious sandwiches. But of course, to make sourdough, you need a sourdough starter. And they do take some time to build. You want a jar big enough that every day for about like a week, you can kind of combine 50 grams of water and flour until you get a soupy paste. Then, like I'm doing here, you want to start discarding it and then refilling it. I throw out like about 100-ish grams at a time, so I do like 50 grams of water, 50 grams of flour, and then I just combine it all again. You don't want to discard anything in the first week of your starter, but you will know that your starter is ready to use not only when it smells nice and sour, but when it's able to actually double in volume. Wherever its resting point is when you're done mixing it, you want to make sure it actually does double from that, and that's how you know the yeast is alive and active. Because it's actually the gas in the yeast that causes your bread to rise really nicely and not be so dense. And you can add any flavors to it, so like my favorites are cinnamon and craisin, or some pumpkin seeds, or some sesame seeds, and they are all really good for different magical combinations. But for my bread recipe, it's really just 600 grams of water and all of the starter copy that I made, that levain. You don't want to use your actual starter when you're making bread because the amount that you're going to need to make it is so much that you will run out of starter very quickly. So you just take a little bit of it and put it in a separate jar with more flour and water, and then it poofs up like you saw earlier. This is what we are mixing here with all of this water to make sure it is kind of fully dissolved, because unlike the instant yeast, this stuff is kind of goopy. And of course, the flour you use is important too. We're using bread flour, which has a higher protein percentage in it. Gluten, the thing that holds bread together, is actually a protein, and so you want a lot of it so that it can actually hold its structure. So I add about 750 grams of bread flour before adding about 150 grams of wheat flour. As you can see, the wheat flour has a higher gluten-forming protein content, and that is important. So where yeast gives it the gas to rise, gluten gives it the structure to stay together. And when you want your salt, you want something without iodide for sourdough, because iodide will kill the yeast. Even with instant yeast, you want to put it off to the side. But here I'm using 18 grams for all of this flour. And if you don't have this, I really recommend you get it. It's a Danish dough whisk, and it makes it a lot easier to mix all of your bread together. A balloon whisk will pretty easily get all this stuff trapped inside, and it's just really annoying to work with. But this lets stuff pass right through it, and it is then very easy to get any leftover dough off of it. All you gotta do is mix all of this into about a shaggy ball, and then just cover it and rest it for an hour. My house is cold, so I like to put it in my oven with the oven light on. Not the actual oven itself, just the oven light. In the summer, you might be able to leave it out on the table, but it will rise a lot faster. But once an hour has passed, it's time to just take it out, and this is where we're going to slap and fold, which is where a lot of the gluten starts forming. When you beat dough up like this, that's what makes all that gluten form all those bonds that make it stretchy and hold shape. But when you're slapping and folding, what you're doing really is dragging it back and then tossing it forward. And you do want to use a little bit of force to it. You don't want to just kind of drop it gently. You want to pick it up and slap it. And as you can see, the more time goes on as I'm, slapping and folding, the less it's looking weird and gummy, and the more it's kind of becoming this smooth, nice texture. Once it is smooth enough and it's not like super sticky and gross and all over your hands, then it is time to just put it back into its bowl and then rest it for another 30 minutes. This recipe is a riff off of Josh Weissman's, and he says to do this for 2 to 4 minutes, but really, so long as you have like a nice smooth surface, you're good. I noticed that when you go by time rather than by feel, you end up easily breaking it and like ripping holes into it, which is no good. The biggest thing about bread is learning the feel of it and learning how to tell when things are done, when things are proofed, when things are not proofed enough, all that kind of stuff. The more you do it, the easier it'll get, and soon it'll be just like second nature. But now that that's all wrapped up, you're going to stick it back into your warm place for half an hour before you start messing with it again. And now here comes the part of sourdough that can get a little intensive. Once that half an hour is up, you're going to stretch your bread, and you're going to do this in 3 intervals of 15 minutes, and then you're going to do it in 3 intervals of 30 minutes. You might need to stretch it another couple times depending on how stretchy it is. This is after a few of these rounds of stretching. As you can see, it stretches pretty nicely, but in the first couple ones it will kind of tear a little easily, so you have to be careful. But by building all that gluten, when you have a fresh piece of bread, you'll actually be able to notice how the gluten strands kind of ripped a little bit. It looks like little strands. That is how you know that your bread is nice and strong. But after the last set of stretch and folds, all you're going to do is start to pre-shape it, which means kind of scooping it back around into a ball. So you kind of like move it up and then tuck it under over and over again until it becomes a little taut ball. After that, dust some cornmeal into a bread basket like this, and then you're going to make a actual like jelly roll shape with your bread. It's kind of like swaddling a baby and then just kind of making this little roll down. And then you flip it over so the seam side is up, and then you just pinch that seam closed. This is what's going to go on your cast iron pot if you're making like a rustic loaf. This is the part that's going to go directly down on the surface. If you're baking regular bread in a pan, you put that seam side down into the bread pan. But this was a loaf that came out of that, and I just stick it in the fridge to preserve it for even longer, and then I have bread pretty much all week. I hope you guys give it a try, and I'll see you next week. By the way, if you want to see these videos 2 weeks earlier, consider subscribing to my Patreon, where you not only get all these videos, but also recipe cards, specific deity profiles, and lots of other interesting things to look at. Video tiers start at $10 a month, so definitely consider checking it out.